Good morning. Now today we're going to do a little more rambling, dusting off some of the old memories about my early recollection in Rogers City. This is Harry Grambua at 386 North 6th Street, Rogers City. And this is April 17th, 1994. As I start this recording, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, a.m., and about 35 degrees, and it's sunny out. Just got through talking on the phone with my brother George and Martha in Lansing, and they said it was 50 there and cloudy. Now Lake Huron, I can see from my window here, is very, very blue this morning, and most of the ice is gone, and the boats are moving up and down the lakes. The local limestone company is loading boats out of the local port so that the sailors are gone again for another year. As I said before, Rogers City has a nautical flavor in that it's the wife of the family who raises the kids, as she's almost in total charge for 8.5 to 9 months out of the year if the husband is a sailor. That's the way there's always been in a sailor's home. Now to get back to our old home on the corner of 3rd and Woodward here in Rogers City that was built in 1911, 1912. 1911 is the year that I was born. The local quarry, as we call it here, the plant, started also in 1911. And I might say that the train came in to Rogers City the first time in 1911. In fact, the first train that came into the city of Rogers City, the depot was at the corner of Ontario and 2nd Street. And that train came in there, a big town gathering, on December 18th, 1911. So I beat the train coming into Rogers City by 3 days. The D&M Railroad had been built off of a spur that came close to Posen on the D&M. They built a track into the local quarry area because they needed to bring in a lot of equipment to get that plant started. And then later on, about a year or so later, they extended the track right into the city of Rogers City itself. Now, the first depot, as they say, was at the corner of Ontario and 2nd. Then later on they extended it along 2nd Street right down the middle of the street to the old depot site as we knew it as kids. That site today is occupied by the Bowie restaurant. Then that train, they detached the engine and the carrier, or the fuel carrier, and the train was sidetracked. That is, the train went on and turned around at what they called a landing. And we didn't have a roundhouse here to turn the engine around, so they went down there and through a series of tracks, they turned that engine around. The engine came back down, then hooked on again to the cars, and away we went. That's the way they did it. Now, the train never did go on from there. Rogers City was a spur. And the question has been asked many times, is how come that train didn't keep right on going, right on up along the lake, where the US 23 now goes to Sheboygan? Well, the reason was, and I guess it's probably a good one, is that between Rogers City and Sheboygan there wasn't anything but woods. All along that whole 40-mile area, there wasn't a single community along that area. And that's true today. Between Rogers City and Sheboygan, there are no communities. And so, of course, the road from Rogers City, the main connecting line, went to Onaway. It went inland. And the old D&M track, of course, was built from Alpena up through Castro and Bolton, Posen, Metz, Hawks, Millersburg, Onaway, and then up to Sheboygan along by Billet Lake. So that's the story there. Now, when they built the company plant, or the limestone company plant on the lake at Calcite, which is about 1.5 or 2 miles just south of Rogers City, they needed power to operate their equipment, and so they built a power plant first. They built a plant right at the edge of the lake down there, a power plant, and then the coal was brought in right to that point, and that's where they generated their power. And after they got started, then of course they sold some power to a local power company that had been created, and a line was run from there, about 1.5 miles, to a large complex or transformer station, which was located right on Woodward Avenue, just about a half a block from our home, as you recall it. That headquarters for that power company was right in back of the Dr. Arscott home, or the Tony Shabella home at the present time. And some of that structure is still there. For a while in later years, it was used as a headquarters for Michigan Limestone Chemical Company. But part of that building is still there. Now, of course, we said that the coal was brought in by boat, and later on, of course, people who had been burning wood all these years in Rogers City could then burn coal, and many of them installed furnaces in their homes. So the power company was organized about around 1912 or 13. They started to build lines in 1914, and I know in our particular home, the home was wired about 1916 or 17. Now, before that, of course, everybody, including our home, will use kerosene lamps. And that was just like they did throughout the rest of the country and in the rural areas here until the REA built lines going into the various farms. Now, we burned lamps in our home, and I have one of the original lamps that came out of the Grambua home, and I know that George has one, the old kerosene lamps. Now, I think the one that George has been electrified, later on electrified, but mine is still the original with the wick, and you burn regular kerosene and it still burns. I have it set up so that in case the power goes out, that's one source of light that we have. Now, when the power came in, of course, it was necessary for all the homes in Rogers City to be wired for electricity. Now, in our particular case, it was kind of an easy job because the upstairs in our original home was a great big barn-like basketball court up there before they divided it off. Now, at the time that they built the house, they did supply one room upstairs, which we call the back room, till today the ones that the girls use. That was a small room that had been built on there, and it was that room enough for a couple of beds, but it only had a single small window in it that faced to the back of the house. And in later years, of course, that was remodeled when they after we remodeled the home. But at the time that the house was wired, it was relatively easy to wire our house because the upstairs was unfinished, and so they could get into the ceiling areas of the base of the first floor and in between the joists. And after that was all in, then of course, a few years later, Mother and Dad remodeled the whole upstairs. They put in those upstairs bedrooms with their closets, and then they enlarged, almost tripled the size of the back bedroom. They raised the roof and put in 4 windows in the back and big closets, and that's the room, as you recall, that had the chimney from the basement coming right up through the center of the room. It was plastered nicely, and because when you in the wintertime, it was nice and warm. That chimney was kind of a back warmer for the girls that had to get dressed there in the wintertime. It's still there today, and it still looks good. I also recall that, speaking about that back bedroom where the girls slept, in the mornings lots of time, Dad would go to open up the stairs to the upstairs from downstairs, and he would have the dog with him, Kazan, and he would say, go on up and get him out of there. And the dog would bound upstairs, and he'd get into that room, and he'd jump on the bed, lick the girls across the face a few times, and then Dad would smile and close the door. And then pretty soon, a little later on, the kids would come downstairs, and they would be snorting about the goddamn dog washing their face with his tongue. And Dad would listen, and He always had a big smile on his face. Now, one thing that I recall about that back bedroom upstairs is that is where the girl of the house stayed. We had a number of girls that came in from the farms that worked in the home during the course of the week. These were young girls, probably 14 to 18, 19 years old, and they came off the farms, so they came in and they helped and they take care of the home, helped mother take care of the younger kids. They did the washing and the ironing and everything that the lady of the house did, they did, including some of the cooking, including some of the weeding of the vegetable garden, picking some of the vegetables out of the garden, but they were just considered a part of the family. And that was their room upstairs. They were treated like part of the family. They came in, usually came in on a Sunday evening off the farms, and then they stayed until Saturday right after breakfast, and then they left. Now they went back on the farms, or they probably went and visited other people in the community, and in certain cases they probably stayed right through the week. If they had a date with some young guy in town, they probably stayed there all during the week. Now, these people, of course, were farm girls that were used to work, and they could do a multiple of things, and that was very, very common because young girls, like young boys, had to find something to do. Most of those farms were too small to require any more than just a given number of adult help, and so young people had to go out and find something else to do. And so they went to Rogers City to work, or they went to Alpena, or they went to Sheboygan, or they went to Bay City and Saginaw and Flint and Pontiac and Detroit and sought employment. They still do it today. Rogers City has always exported its young talent. I remember that when I was at the school, I looked it up on quite a few occasions, and I figured that at the time, in the early days, they used to ship out about 2/3 of their young people. And when I was there, it got down to about a quarter. Only about a quarter of the people that graduated through the school system stayed in Rogers City. They could find work at the plant, or they could find work on the boats, or they found work in one of the local business establishments. But only a few of them could stay on the farms because those were mostly all generally small farms. So it isn't any different today. You have to get out and go someplace else for employment. I know that's true in our case. None of the kids in our family stayed in Rogers City except myself, and that was just through a circumstance where I became a teacher, and this is the first job that I found open at the time that I was looking for employment. But I know Herb went to Detroit. George went into service, and then, of course, he has worked in various communities in Michigan and all over the United States. The twins went to Detroit, and Grace went to Detroit, and that was true in many, many families, the same thing. Unless you worked at the plant, or as I say, on the boats, or could get established in some local business that was made enough money, you just had to go out. And so that's the way that worked. Now, just as to who were some of these girls that worked for the folks. Well, I remember. I think I remember most of them. The first one that I recall was a girl named Elsie Arlt Kleiber from Hawks, and she was Elsie Arlt. That's an Arlt family that's out there, been out there for years, and she married a Jack Kleiber, who was a farmer out there. And I had 4 or 5 of those Kleiber kids in my classes later on when I came back to teach. Then there was Emma Raskey. Emma Raskey was from Mulkey, and she married a Leonard Polk, a brother to Lyman Polk. There was Johanna Turner Tischler. Johanna was my neighbor here for 40 years, right next door. And she's now living. She's still about 93 years old. She lives out on a home out here on Hightower Highway. And she was from the Mulkey area. And then there was a girl by the name of Lillian Merchant. She was from the Akiak area. Now, I don't remember just who Lillian married, but I do remember seeing her even in later years. For a while, she was a patient in the extended care at the same time that mother was up there. And I remember going in and talking to her and also meeting some of her children. And then there was a Bertha Hardy's Zinke. Bertha Hardy's was a cousin of mother's. She came from the Belknap area, a member of the Hardy's family. She married Herman Zinke, and 3 of her sons, I had all 3 of them in class. And the last one that I recall was a girl by the name of Frida Lorke. Frida was from Germany. She had been sponsored to come over to this country by a relative out in Metz called Emil Lipke. And when she got to town, of course, she was looking for a job because she was about 21 or 22 years old at the time. And so she came and worked for the folks for several years. And it was a very good arrangement because Frida didn't know too much English when she came. And, of course, mother and dad, of course, being bilingual, it was a very, very convenient and easy place for her to learn English. And so mother and dad spoke to her, of course, in both English and German, and as a result of it, after about 6 months, she got to be quite fluent. She apparently was a pretty sharp girl herself, but she picked up the vocabulary very, very rapidly. And she and mother kept in contact with each other for over a 50 or 60 year period. I remember that even mother was in her 80s. She was still writing Frida Lorke, who was living in the St. Joe area, and quite often Frida over the years had come up to visit her. Now, another thing I remember about the early days was that not only the wiring of the house, now that we're going to say that house was wired by a man named Brooks, George Brooks. And he was a neighbor, and he had a big, big family of kids. Most of those kids were in high school when Herman and I were in high school. And one of the girls, Ida Bell, still is in Sheboygan today. She was my age, and I graduated with her. Now, another characteristic about that house is that at the time that it was built, in 1911, 1912, in the basement floor in the early days was earthen. It was gravel and sand. The only place that there was any concrete in the basement, on the basement floor, was under the furnace itself. Now, the story of that furnace is kind of interesting. At the time that mother and dad started to plan to build the house, it just happened that my dad showed the plan to C.H. Osgood, who was his boss and who ran the bank. And that's who Dad worked for. And Osgood noted that it didn't have a furnace in it. Well, Dad said it's pretty expensive, just to start in. But Osgood said, he said he didn't think that was right. He said I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, you order the furnace. And he said, I'll pay for it. And then you pay me a couple dollars a month until it's paid off. Well, Dad said that was too good of a deal to pass up, especially at no interest. And so that's how that furnace got in there. And as I say, in the first place they put in a concrete base for the furnace. And so all the leads were put in, and the furnace was put in when the house was built. Now that furnace originally, of course, just burned wood, because we didn't have coal in that quantity at that time yet from the plant. But we burned beech and other hardwoods, and the whole basement area was just loaded with large blocks of wood. And of course, wood was also burned in the kitchen stove. And then later on, a couple of years afterwards, after they got a little money ahead, they put in the rest of the basement floor, and at that time they partitioned part of it off for a fruit cellar and part of it for a coal bin, because what had happened was that the plant agreed to sell a certain amount of their coal to the people in Roger City. And then there were people in town here, the draymen, who went down, got loads of coal for you, and come and put it in your basement. And for a good number of years, then afterwards we burned coal, then we burned coke, we burned soft coal, we burned hard coal. And then later on, many years later, then of course, we got to burning oil. And then now, in the last maybe about 30 years or 25 years, we are burning gas. Most of the furnaces now are gas furnaces. So you see, everything changes. Modifications are continually be made in the homes. Now, another topic that I'd like to just talk to you about that always interested me as a kid, and interested all kids, and that is the old great food that our mothers used to make. Now, all of us kids, it doesn't make not just our own family, but all kids remember the great food that was prepared in the home by our mothers. Of course, you got to remember that our tastes were very, very sharp at that time. The taste buds were not tarnished by anything else. And food tasted good. We were growing physically. We needed a lot of energy, and things tasted good. Some of the most outstanding things that I remember that just apparently appealed to me and my taste was that I had favorites. Now, for me, Mother's old-fashioned roast beef with brown gravy and potatoes, that was ambrosia as far as I was concerned, and I still am a roast beef eater today. Mother was an excellent beef cook. And but I recall other great treats too. And one of the things that comes to mind is that you recall in the summertime, starting from right early in the spring on, right down to fall, right down to frost, is that we had a lot of leaf lettuce for our evening meal. Mother would plant rows and rows of lettuce out there, and we'd go out and pick that leaf lettuce bit by bit until we got a 8, 10, or 12 quart pail full of leaf lettuce. Mother would bring that in, we'd wash it on the outside, the running water from the flowing well, and then she'd come in and then she would lather that with sweet cream that had been doctored up with a little sugar, a little vinegar, and man, that was ambrosia. Another one was to use that lettuce and then cover it with a bacon. Bacon had been fried into small bits, and then the bacon and the grease, along with a wee touch of vinegar again, was kind of lathered over that. It was kind of like a wilted lettuce. And oh boy, did that go good with roast beef or with fried ham. And that was also had a little touch of vinegar. Wow, I can still taste it. Now that along, of course, was always served with Mother's great wheat bread and a lot of butter. Mother used a lot of butter, as I remember, as I told you before. She'd get 3, 4, and 5 pounds of butter a week from the country. People would come in, and one of the great sources of her butter was a Mrs. Turno from Milky. Mrs. Turno was the mother of Anna Turno, or Anna Tischler. And she would come in every week with a big crock. These are earthen crocks of butter, 3, 4, and 5 pounds. And then another great food that we had a lot of, because I suppose, again, we had a good source, and that was eggs. Fresh eggs from the Dranberg and Grambua farms out in Metz. You recall their mother there was a special metal crate that would hold, I think, 12 dozen of eggs. And periodically we'd have to go out there and get another load of eggs. The eggs were, they were cooked in the various ways. They were fried, they were scrambled, they were boiled, and they were served with our own ham and our own country sausage, which we had put up in the fall of the year. And some of my other favorites that I can still taste is Mother's sweet and sour cabbage. Oh, man, was that good. And then there was another dish that I was very fond of. I know some of the kids were and some of the kids weren't, but Dad liked it, and I know Mother liked it. And that was salted keg herring, right out of the kegs, which you bought from the local stores. There used to come in wooden kegs that were about the size of, a gallon and a half or 2 gallons. And those herring were packed in brine. And you opened up the keg, and it looked like a mess in there, but you picked out the fish, washed them off, cleaned them, skinned them, and then after you had enough for a meal or two for 8 people, maybe clean up a dozen of them, then they were put into you freshened it. They were cut in pieces, and then just put plain water over them and let it stand for an hour or two. Pour off the salted water, and do it again, do it several times, and then the last time you did that, then you added vinegar. You added 2/3 of white vinegar and 1/3 of water, and to that were added large slices of onion and bay leaf and black pepper And Mother threw in a couple other little secret ingredients there in the spice area that I don't remember exactly what it was. But then that was marinated. It was set aside, usually in some cool spot, and then it was let stand for a day, and then it was brought up, and that was served along with boiled potatoes. And oh man, was that good. It was just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful food. I know that Marion, when we first told her about it, she said, "Yuck." She said, "I don't think I'd like that." Well, I fixed it, and she liked it. And then I remember we took a keg of it to her folks in Ludington. And by gosh, they liked it. And for years, every time we went back in the fall of the year, around between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we always took a keg of herring. And they thoroughly enjoyed it. But that was kind of a marinated fish. Now, another fish product that we had a lot of, and that was fresh trout, fresh lake trout, or fresh whitefish, or fresh chubs, or fresh herring. You can get this at the local fish docks. Mother would send Herm or I down to the local docks and tell them to meet the tugs down there as they came in, so it would be fresh. Get a 5 or 6 pound trout. Now, trout at that time were probably about 15 cents a pound. Or maybe it was 20, or maybe it was 10. I don't know, but it was very reasonable. And you got a big trout, bring that home. Mother would wash it up, cut up enough, so they'd probably cut up half or 2/3 of it or whatever it was to fry fresh, or half. And then for that evening meal, and then for the next meal, then the rest of that was kept fresh. And then that fish was again boiled. It was boiled in water, and to that water had been added onion and bay leaf and pepper again, and this fish was boiled. Didn't have to boil it too long in that water, in that marinade, you might say. And there was a little vinegar had been added already to that water. Then after a few minutes, after that fish was thoroughly boiled, you took the flesh out, and then you added a little sour cream, a little vinegar, and kind of thickened it up a little bit, and that was served over boiled potatoes. Now, the flesh you could eat just as it was, that is, the pieces of meat, or you could take the meat off the bones and put it right into the stew. And so you had a kind of a fish chowder. And you served that over boiled potatoes, and boy, it was ambrosia. And now I know that not all the kids liked it, but some of them did. I know Mother liked it, Dad liked it, I liked it. I don't know about the rest of them, I can't speak, but boy, I know that Marion learned how to make it years later, and she was very, very fond of it. And of course, I caught a lot of fish. I didn't catch too many lake trout, but I did catch splake, and I did catch salmon, and I did catch a lot of steelhead, and a lot of big steelhead, and it made wonderful fish soup, as well as other fish products. So that's one that I remember. Now let's see what else have I got here. Well, I was just going to say that a lot of people kind of frowned on boiled fish. But even today here in Rogers City, where this has become quite a center for fishing Chinook salmon right out of Lake Huron, a lot of people don't care for fresh salmon fried or baked. But they do have these fish boils, where these chunks of fish are put into a big boiler, and there's certain spices are added to that. And then when the fish is taken out to be eaten, then they have various garnishes that they can put on it. And I've had it, and it tastes almost like lobster. It is very, very delicious. And I don't care for fresh salmon fried or baked. I like canned salmon, but fresh, there's something about it that just doesn't suit me. But very large people in Rogers City do boil it that way and have large feasts with it. Another great treat that I like to remember, and I don't know whether the kids remember it or not, and that was roast goose at Christmas. Every Christmas for years when we were youngsters, that is for Herman and I don't know, George says he doesn't remember it, But we had roast goose that came from the Dramberg farm. Now, they always raised a certain number of geese purposely for the Christmas season. And these geese were sent to their relatives in Detroit and in Toledo. These geese were cleaned, thoroughly cleaned, and then they were put on the train, the old D&M track, and the next day they would be delivered. This was the fall of the year between Christmas and New Year's, so it was pretty cold, so they didn't have to worry about spoilage, and that was their treat to their relatives. And I know Mother and Dad always got one. Now, in cooking a goose, these geese were fat. Oh, man, they were fat. They were purposely fed to be fat. And that grease would just roll on them when you could see it at the time that you put in the stuffing. And Mother used to take as much off as she possibly could get off. And then in order Mother said that it isn't good to have that goose cook in its own grease. And so she had some 1-by-1 wood slats that she put in the bottom of the roaster where she set the goose on that was to be baked or roasted. And then the fat would drip off and it wouldn't sit in its own fat. It was delicious food, and I was very fond of it. And it had a taste that was very distinctive. And I suppose that's what I liked about it. It tasted somewhat like roast wild mallard or wild black duck that I used to get a lot of, and then Marion learned to cook. But roast goose has its own particular flavor, and it is just super delicious. And in Europe today, and in certain places in the United States, it's still considered a very, very a delicacy. And but I don't remember that in later years we had it too much. George said he doesn't recall goose at all. And but I think that we did occasionally have turkeys. Turkeys were raised later on in the later 20s by people in the Akiak area, and Dad always had a standing order for a roast turkey sometime between Thanksgiving and the Christmas era. Now, Mother wasn't too crazy about turkey for some reason or other, and as you recall, over the years we never had it too much. Her favorite was roast beef, and I don't blame her because she really knew how to cook. Not that she couldn't cook turkey or cook chicken, and she did. But I know that in talking to her, it wasn't her favorite food. And but she could prepare it. Now, another reason why I liked the wild goose was that when Mother served the wild goose, or well, not the wild goose, but the goose, and she did on a few occasions make some wild geese, because I shot several wild geese while I was duck hunting and brought those home. But Mother would serve this goose with wild cranberry jelly or wild grape jelly. Now, I told you about that before, that Dad and I used to go out and gather those berries almost every fall. We'd go out and get enough so that Mother could make out a few cans or a few jars. I was especially fond of it, and so was Dad. It was quite tart, but it had a distinctive flavor, entirely different flavor than the tame which we use today. But that was always one of my favorites. And I often think in my own mind, wouldn't it be nice to go back to some of those branches, the early creek branches of the Thunder Bay River, and see whether those wild cranberry were still growing on those big stalks along the riverbank. There were also places up in the upper area of Trout River where they also grew. And I remember that Mrs. Bertha Kowaleski, used to gather some of that. She'd bring in 4 or 5, 6 or 8 quarts of that stuff in the fall of the year because she knew that George and Alma liked those wild cranberries. And it just so happened that her kids didn't like it. But George and Alma always bought these boxes from her of wild cranberry, and she, as long as she could. Now, Mrs. Kowaleski, Bertha Kowaleski, was the sister to Grandma Hahn, as you recall. Now, I can't say that the rest of the kids were very fond of that grape jelly, the wild grape jelly, or the wild cranberry jelly. Now, the wild grape jelly, of course, we got from Lost Lake. And I fished there after some years after the property. Dad and Mother sold that property, and I didn't go on the land, but I took a boat from the opposite shore, and those grapes were still there. You could just see them hanging there. I went out there fishing in the fall of the year, bass fishing, and the birds were in there just feeding on those grapes. Of course, those grapes have been there since time immemorial. In fact, Dad told me that his dad, Herman Grambua, had harvested that area of pine, and they had a camp there at one time on Lost Lake, and Dad said that at that time those grapes were there because they could see them. They had dried up. They were there in the wintertime, of course, harvesting pine, but along the shore those grapes were there at that time, so you can see that's been there for 100 years. And but I don't really recall anything much about goose dinners after approximately 1930. Now, well, I still have a little time here. I want to mention another thing that happened in those early days. Along about 1927, Dad took Herman and I and George on a trip out to Nebraska and Kansas to see the relatives out there. And on the way down there, we took the old Model A Ford, and we stopped in at Chicago to see a cousin of his, William Schultz, who lived in Winnetka. Now, Schultz was a relative through marriage, and we stopped in at this home in Winnetka and stayed overnight there, or 2 nights. And this Bill had become a very, very successful machinist, and he was connected with the Great Northern Railway, and he was responsible. One of his jobs was to oversee the repair of those large locomotives for the Great Northern Railroad that ran all the way to Canada, ran across the northern United States. They would come in there for repair, and he was a kind of a foreman. He had learned that trade from the ground up through an apprenticeship. And how he got there, Dad said he didn't know, but he had worked himself up into a very, very responsible job, and apparently must have made an excellent salary, because the home that he had was very beautiful and large. And he took us out to the railroad yard, where there was a large roundhouse where they were repairing these mammoth engines for these trains that ran to the West Coast. And at that one evening, while we were there in Chicago, he took us downtown Chicago to a theater where we saw our first talkie. It was a short run. This was a regular theater. Then we saw a regular movie, but it was silent. But it was also where they had a certain amount of stage show with the entertainment. But this was about a 15-minute running of the first talkie, and the actor was Al Jolson. We were very, very intrigued, and of course there was a big lineup of people waiting to get at that show. But Dad said afterwards that Schultz had got the tickets from his company. Apparently these companies bought certain blocks of tickets for entertainment of customers and stuff like that, and Schultz was able to get some, and so he took us all at company expense to see this great talking machine. And then from there we went on across Iowa, and then across Illinois, across Iowa, into Omaha, into Lincoln, and we got to Lincoln, Nebraska. We stopped there for a day, and we went to the newly built Capitol. That Capitol of Nebraska, of course, is a unicameral legislature, and they're just about almost ready to be dedicated. But they were taking people through, and we went through that beautiful, beautiful structure. It's still an imposing sight today. And there, after that, then we went on to Fairfield, Nebraska, and that's where Joseph Johns lived. Now, Joseph Johns had married Ernestine Grambua, Grandpa Herman Grambua's sister. And what happened there was that when they came over from Germany, the Grambuas stopped there around Tonawanda, New York, near Buffalo. And other people, this other family by the name of Johns, had come in there from England. Well, young Joseph Johns and Ernestine Grambua liked each other, so they decided to get married right then and there. And then one of the Schultz girls decided that she wanted to get married, and she married a fellow by the name of Linky. And he later became a minister, and she stayed there. So that when Ernestine never yet got up here to Alpena and Metz or to Belknap, she went with her new husband out to Nebraska. And they settled on a homestead on a piece of land. I don't know just how many acres or whether it was a mile square land. And they became farmers out there. And they had a couple of kids, a boy and a girl. And then Ernestine died. And I remember we went to see her grave at Fairfield, Nebraska. And he was then Joseph became you got the wanderlust. And so he left his two kids with some friends. And he took off and went to Colorado and California, just kind of gallivanting around, trying to find out or make up his mind what he was going to do with the rest of his life. And he stayed away, and he stayed away, and he stayed away. And what happened was that the girl got married, the daughter got married, and the family that they'd farmed the kids out to was named McFarland. Well, they became very, very attached to young McFarland and the boy. And so they, all of a sudden, these people up and left. They up and left the Fairfield, Nebraska area. Nobody knew where they went. And it just happened that these people wanted to keep that boy. They didn't want to give that boy up after Joe Johns came back. Well, after a couple of years, Joe Johns did come back, and when he got back, there was nothing there. His daughter was married, but she didn't know where the brother was. And so where was he? Well, after a period of time, I don't know how long it took, but he finally found out that the family had moved out of Nebraska into Kansas and was settled in the Norton, Kansas area. And so he finally went down to located him, and in the meantime, these McFarlands had adopted that boy as an orphan. Well, then, of course, Johns wanted him to come back. The kid didn't want to go. He said he wouldn't go back. He was probably 16 or 17 or 18 years old. He wasn't going to go back. He liked it where he was. These people treated him fine. Well, finally, I guess Johns decided, best thing to do is just leave the situation where he was, as long as the boy was happy and these people treated him fair. That was good enough for him. But Johns never remarried. But we stayed with Joseph Johns for a while around Fairfield, Nebraska, and then we went down to Norton, Kansas. And these McFarlands had a big farm. Oh, it must have been at least a section of land. And they raised corn, and they raised wheat, and they raised sunflowers. And they had a few cattle, but they weren't in the cattle business. They were just in the business of raising feed. And there were about 3 boys and a girl, or 3 boys and 2 girls in that family. 2 of them I remember. One was Floyd, and the other was Joe. And I still write to Joe. I got a letter from him not too long ago, and we've exchanged pictures that were taken at that time. And these were kids just our age. They were in high school, and some of them were in grade school like George was. And they had horses around there that we could ride. And now, the interesting thing is this, that every evening during the summertime, or I don't know whether every evening, but twice when we were there, we went down to a river. I don't know whether it was a branch of the Red River or was a branch of the Arkansas River. Anyway, there was a river that was about 3/4 of a mile away from the house, and it was a pretty good-sized stream, and the kids had hollowed out a great big area there, probably, that was, I would just maybe about 50 by 100, where they just broadened the river bottom because it was all clay and sand, and they had a great big swimming hole there. They had a diving board, and at one spot the water was probably about 6 foot deep, but a lot of it wasn't that deep. And here were these kids, all young people, just having the time of their life. They were cooling off after a hot day in the sun, and it was hot out there. But the thing that bothered me was that when I looked at that water was brown. And I, of course, was used to swimming in Lake Huron, where the water was clear and you could see the bottom of the area that we swam. But that's all the kids had when I